Hello, good evening, everybody. My name's Jamie, and I work for Cumbria Wildlife Trust. We're just about to start in a couple of minutes. We've 150 people here already, but we've, I think, 260 registered. So I'm going to do my little trick of just putting a piece of music on, because it partly calms me down, but it gives us a chance just to let people who are finishing their tea or just arriving or just remembering where they'd like to be. This is a piece of music which links to tonight. It's one you may have heard before if you joined us for session 1. Welcome back if you did. Don't worry if you didn't. This doesn't rely on you having attended session 1. Anyway, here's Charm on Goldfinch.
Goldfinch in its way, gilt with grey. Change and the season fades. Goodbye to the sun. Goodbye, golden one. Charm on, Goldfinch, charm on. Heaven help us when all your gold is gone. Charm on, Goldfinch, charm on. Heaven help us when all your gold is Charm on, Goldfinch, charm on. Heaven help us when all your gold is gone. Charm on, Goldfinch, charm on. Heaven help us when all your gold is gone.
Well, that's done me good, and I'm glad to see we've actually broken the 200 mark, which is, I think it's a bit of a record. I hope that's I hope you all have a really good time. I know things are very tricky at the moment, and I know things are particularly difficult for all kinds of reasons. But the main thing is for tonight is it's a little bit of a distraction. Hopefully we find all kinds of reasons to think about and to visit and to try and learn more about nature that's around us. I'm giving you a backwards preview of where we're going because we've started at the end, which is probably an unusual place to start. So you've got a little bit of a glimpse of things that may, at the moment, overwhelm, at things that might confuse, at things you may find familiar, at things you might have seen yourself or would like to see one day. The birds we'll talk about tonight, as I say, don't rely by any means on things that you may have seen in the last session. What I've tried to do with the series of courses has been to start from scratch, assume no prior knowledge, because even if people do know things, and we all know something, and we all know things we don't realise, we have to start from somewhere, haven't we? And we mentioned at the very end of last session a group of what we might call garden birds. Typically, garden birds were woodland birds originally, birds that have adapted to gardens and the fact that we may provide food and safety and habitat for birds in our gardens. So the woodland, what we might now call garden birds, include a group which includes this particular bird we started with. We've thought of Goldfinch, perhaps within the song. Here's a different kind of finch, a chaffinch. This is one of the interesting things for me with birds. If I think back to 2007 or 8, I was on the other side of the world, sat by a lake, and birds came around me and I didn't know what they were. And I assumed there was some local rarity, some speciality of the other side of the world. They happened to be chaffinches, but I was struck by their personality, their colour, their behaviour. I didn't know what they were. So I start as an absolute beginner. And I didn't actually study birds at all until just a couple of years ago because I was overwhelmed by them. It seemed far easier to me to start on something like trees and mushrooms and things that were a little bit more niche rather than the whole wide display of birds that we might see. So accepting that I didn't know what this was not too long ago. This is a chaffinch with two pictures, one above the other. And you could see these side by side and not realise it's actually just a male and female of the same species. A male chaffinch below, the colourful, more colourful one perhaps, female above on the twig. But actually a chaffinch in flight looks nothing like a chaffinch at rest. So when we think about bird ID, what we always must remind ourselves is we're not going to necessarily get the textbook picture of a bird looking left or right or behaving itself. We may well see things flying away from us. And chaffinch I use as a good example of in flight, I can see green and black and white and not the colours I'd typically be looking for. So sometimes we're looking for different things. And when it comes to identifying birds, it's a really good reminder that you're going to see them in unusual ways when they fly away from you, when they're not at rest. Not all birds differ between male and female. I've used this as a good example of birds that, if we actually think of the shape, the characteristics, if we look at those black and white patches, what they might call wing bars, we've got some similarities. If we look at the legs, very similar colours. If we look at the fact it's a bird that perches on things, there's similar kinds of behaviours. And we might observe them feeding on similar kinds of food. So we start to think, when we think of birds, not only what we see. I have some problems with my sight and with my hearing, and that's okay. You know, lots of people do. There are some things I can't hear, and there are some colours I don't see as others would see them. So this is going to make tonight interesting, I'm sure. So we're starting with what I would call a simple bird, a chaffinch. Chaffinches are not at all sociable. Now that's a really important point. When we start to talk about birds at a different level, we talk about how they behave. Now, because chaffinches are really feeding their young on insects, birds will be setting up nests soon in spring, and they're reliant on insects. They can patrol a little territory that will supply sufficient insects. So chaffinches are a good example of a bird that's going to look to keep a territory clear of other chaffinches. It's unlikely you'll see them getting along soon very well. The singing has just started. And what you might remember from last session is I have this device called Bird Voice. This is something that we've had for years at the Trust. It's a really good, this is sort of pre-internet, but it's still better in my view, because you can take it out in the rain. But I'm going to play you a little touch of Chaffinch song. I've heard this in Cumbria, I think, for just over the last week. And bearing in mind the idea that they do patrol the territory, once you hear a Chaffinch, if you hear one at home, it's very likely you're going to keep on hearing that. And the repetition is going to make it really much easier for getting used to, because it's that repetition that gives you your sort of knowledge. So this is how a Chaffinch would sing. I'm just going to play the song for you for now. Let's see how this goes. And one last time. Now, the issue for me with the Chaffinch is, how would you describe that? A lot of the guidebooks, a lot of the hints and tips you can get, they seem to have things that work for the describer rather than for the person listening. But the way I visualize that sound is it's falling downstairs. It's a descending sound. It's a bit disorderly, and it kind of tumbles downstairs and catches itself in a pile at the bottom. Some people describe it actually as someone running up as if to bowl a cricket ball, that there's a kind of and then a flourish at the end. Other people come up with other ideas. Once we start getting into words like trills and rattles and wheezes and sneezes, I don't know what that means. So I try and visualize that sound. And if I'm with a group, I'll actually move my hand in the pattern of the sound, and you see that descending noise. So the Chaffinch is singing there. Now, the reason I talk about singing is, we did mention last time that there's a difference between when a bird sings, which it would be doing now because it's trying to keep that territory, keep those insects for itself, it's trying to advertise itself to a mate. But it also does contact calls when it's just keeping in touch. So I'll just play the song once more, and I'll play the call as well, and you'll see what I mean. So what we've got there is that difference between the song going, down the stairs, and also just a simple rhythm almost. Chaffinches often make a noise simply like the word wheat or pink. And that's what we'll be thinking about tonight, that there's songs and calls. There's different types of things for different reasons. Moving on from Chaffinch. Now, this is a much rarer bird these days, sadly, in gardens, but we've got some similarities with Chaffinch, in that there's a very obvious distinctive thing going on with the wing. There's pretty strong looking beak there. Goldfinch that we've mentioned. Now, this is where it starts to be interesting to me, because when we look at the distinctive characteristic of that gold bar on the goldfinch, we've got some gold going on there on a very different finch, the greenfinch. So that's why we must look at birds, as I mentioned last time, start at the head and think about what's the beak like, the eye like, the hat, the head shape, what colours can I see and where on the back and the front? Because it's very likely you'll see something and think, well, I know the yellow wing means goldfinch, but that's not a goldfinch, so what's happening? But if we were looking at the beak and head of this bird, we would see that's very, very different indeed, much sharper beak on the goldfinch. The goldfinch is a really interesting one, because we're starting to get a bird there which looks very similar, male and female. There's a tiny difference to do with the red and black on its face. And there's a more interesting difference perhaps with goldfinches, in that the male's beak is a little bit longer, long enough to go into the flower heads of teasels to look for seeds. The females can't reach the seeds in teasels. But there's a nice division of food there, in that the goldfinch will feed on teasels as wildflowers, where the female goldfinch will feed on other docks and different flowers and different seeds. Plenty to go around, really. The goldfinch, much smaller than the greenfinch. And that means when we come to feeding, that the goldfinch can hop onto flowers and be quite acrobatic in a way that the greenfinch couldn't. Now, do you remember when I said the chaffinch, the first bird we looked at? The chaffinch patrols a territory because it likes to use insects as food, particularly for its youngsters. Well, this is where it's interesting because the greenfinch is entirely different. The greenfinch is much more a seed eater of a bird. Now you have to travel a lot more to collect the seeds, and that means that your area becomes impossible to patrol. So greenfinches are actually much more sociable. So if there were more around, we'd see more evidence of them being sociable. But it's to do with the way in which they live, affects their behaviour, affects how they spend their energy. Rather than patrolling and defending a territory, they're actually quite sociable and happy to move around in flocks. The reasons for greenfinches being much lower in number was discovered, you may remember last time we talked about the Big Garden Bird Watch. In January, and the importance of having clean bird feeders. Greenfinches were particularly hit by picking up diseases on bird feeders because obviously there's lots of birds visiting them. So it was a really interesting thing where we could track the declining numbers everywhere and then trace that back to this issue around perhaps disease spread by unclean bird feeders. So we've talked very quickly there. I'm just going to summarize it on one slide. The Charm of Goldfinch there by Carl Bovis, excellent photographer, particularly of birds. If you're interested in social media, Carl puts his photographs on Twitter and I think other platforms, and his handle there at Carl Bovis Nature. There's a daily goldfinch and many other things to see too. But there's a great example of goldfinches being reasonably good at being together. As I say, males and females look very, very similar, so we can't tell which is which there, and that will increase the numbers given that you get mixed flocks. Last but not least, one more finch. Very rarely seen, the bullfinch. Now, the bullfinch, going back hundreds of years, was seen as a pest of orchards because we've got a different feeding behaviour. Bullfinches were observed eating buds, and particularly in orchards, that was an issue because it was felt it was hampering the fruit crops. And there were bounties put on bullfinches to try and preserve the crops. And some of those ideas have carried on for a long, long time about pest species and things that should be controlled. Now, although bullfinches eat buds, it's not their food of choice. They'd be much happier eating ash seeds on ash trees. And these days they're seen quite infrequently, but potentially in gardens, on bird feeding stations and so on. They adapt as other birds do. And the truth was, if there'd been other food sources, they'd have probably been elsewhere. So this whole legacy of being treated as a pest species is an interesting one. Now, this is a male bullfinch, very, very bright, very distinct black cap. The female has a more dusty pink, a kind of 1980s pink, I would call it, rather than this very bright colour. And they'll often be seen in pairs, but not necessarily close together. So yeah, bullfinches, that's kind of a lovely thing if you get a chance to see a bullfinch. I've seen them in some unusual locations around industrial estates as much as around gardens, actually. And that just summarises the finches together, to come back to what I was saying, that it's very easy to be confused by birds, but if you start to look at the sizes, the beaks, the face, and then start to look at the colours and the shapes, you can start to draw distinctions. And if you only know a goldfinch, or if you only know a bullfinch, that's fine, because you know what the other things aren't, and you can start to narrow down to what they are. There's one last song I'm going to play you because I'm really waiting for this one. It hasn't happened yet. Greenfinch have a really peculiar song, or I think they do. Now, I actually discount most of the song, and this is another little technique with some birds in particular. A greenfinch is a great example. I don't worry about the majority of it, and to be honest, I don't recognise most of it generally. But within a greenfinch's song, that's the bird bottom left, a greenfinch makes a sound which I would spell as ZW E. It's a kind of zwee noise, a really strange, slightly scratchy noise, slightly excited noise, and it's within the song. But once you hear that, that's your hook for a greenfinch, even if you can't see it, because they're very good at hiding. And as I've said, they're not quite as common as the other birds we've talked about, chaffinches and goldfinches. But I'd like to play you a greenfinch, just for you to try what I do. By all means, if you can get the song, great. But if you can't, about 2/3 of the way through, I think you'll hear this sweet, scratchy noise. And you'll see that's actually what I rely on for a greenfinch, because it's quite unlike anything else. So here's greenfinch. So that's what I mean by ignoring the song and actually just looking for the zwee, the scratchy noise. I'll play it one more time and I'll try and indicate it. I was shaking my head when the song comes through because, as I say, the song in that one, I really don't pick up. But the zwee, I think, is unmissable. We'll try it one more time. I don't know what was going on there. We'll try that again. That's it. So that's an idea of not actually recognizing the whole song, but looking for a characteristic that you can latch onto. And the zwee, for me, the sound of a greenfinch. Very, very quickly, looking at the birds that we looked at last time in some respects, but putting them together, sometimes you'll have this opportunity at home to see things side by side, and that again helps you to drill down because you know the top bird on the left is not the bird underneath it, the bird underneath it being a blue tit. The bird on the left might be mistaken for the bird on the right. It's not got any yellow on it. The two birds down together generally turn up en masse. That's something different again. What we've got here is a group of birds that we can see as, this includes long-tailed tits down at the bottom. Yellow and black, that's a great tit. That's bigger than all the other birds. And the great tit is yellow and black. Male and females have a very slight difference between the black stripe, but otherwise these birds all look very similar between males and females. Blue tit is the thing that some of us will remember for sitting on tops of milk bottles and very commonly seen bird. And the top left is actually a kind of black and white grey bird. If you look at the back of its head, it's got a white patch. Now for me, that's what I always look out for if I'm not sure. This black and white headed bird is a coal tit. And a coal tit is slightly smaller than all the other birds we can see there. But we also can think a little bit about feeding behaviour, particularly on our garden feeders. This is where we get into pecking order and how birds treat each other. Now, this is really interesting to me because the coal tit spends almost all its time trying to feed. It's the smallest bird. It's the most likely to be harassed by everything else. Now, that means it's developed a really brilliant strategy. And you'll notice when a coal tit feeds, it zooms in, picks something up and zooms off straight away. It's like a little ninja, an absolute sort of very fast smash and grab kind of feeder. And that's a coal tit's really, that's its sort of MO when it comes to feeding, its way of working. The reason being, if it hangs around, it gets bullied. So coal tits will fly in ever so quickly, really hard to photograph because they fly off just as quickly with their food. Very often they cache food just short term for a few days because they're taking the opportunities they can when they're not going to get bullied by these other birds. Blue tits are kind of medium sized between the coal tit and the yellow and black great tit. The great tit may be the biggest bird, but being big doesn't mean you're going to be dominant because you've got to be fleet of foot as well, because there's a sparrowhawk somewhere looking to pick off small songbirds. So actually blue tits can give a great tit a run for their money, and within great tits, it's not generally the biggest one that's the boss. It's one that's actually very, very quick as well as quite tough. So you've got this interesting interplay between these birds that will want to kind of keep control of the feeder while they're around it quite often. But I would say they're a really good exercise in looking at bird behaviour. The long-tailed tits down at the bottom, tail as long as the body, well, they tend to move as big family, extended family groups. So if you are lucky enough to see them, very often they're in woodland above you moving through trees. And if you see one, I guarantee you there's half a dozen or a dozen of them. Long-tailed tits have started to visit gardens. They don't hang around. They don't need to. They're used to ranging freely. So it's quite rare for them to stick around for very long, quite hard again. Not like the coal tit, that sort of dash and grab of the coal tit. But I mention them mainly because hopefully these are birds that you may know one or two of. You may not know all of them. But if we start to look at them and look at their differences, we've got obviously colour differences. We've got the white patch on the back of the coal tit, the long tail of the long-tailed tit. But we've got the way in which they feed, and it's very, very different. That they'll kind of have a bit of a standoff between great tits and blue tits and so on. Someone actually studied this. I was reading this today, and they said that great tits generally get bothered 5 times an hour. Blue tits get harassed 15 times an hour. The poor old coal-tit gets hassled 23 times an hour by other birds when they're feeding. So that's what's created those differences in behaviour. Very, very quickly, another wonderful photographer, really good naturalist to look at if you're interested in social media, would be John Walters. He spends a lot of his time, he's very into insects, and he's helped me identify beetles in the past. But this is an example of what he loves doing, which is to find the roosts for birds. The long-tailed tits, famously, that flock that I mentioned, will get together on a little branch, huddle up, the dominant ones in the middle, getting the warmth on both sides, the less dominant ones on the end. It's a little bit like 10 in the bed. But they make absolutely fascinating nests. Now, a quick word on this. John knows what he's doing, but I don't photograph nests which are in use, because the last thing you want to do is disturb a bird that's incubating eggs or trying to set up a territory. Some birds abandon nests very, very readily, and you can really cause trouble. But if you look here on the left, there's almost an invisible nest in the crook of a tree there. Then John zoomed in to show the bird in it. It's a nest made predominantly of mosses and lichens and held together with spider web silk. The reason being is it creates this incredible nest that can actually stretch like one of those mesh shopping bags where you could keep adding more and more shopping and it just grows bigger to accommodate. So it's actually an expandable nest. The other very curious thing with long-tailed tits is they feather their nests with hundreds and hundreds of feathers. And the question then comes in as to where do they find all the feathers? Well, they're actually very, very, very clever. And if they find a dead bird anywhere, then that's where they get their feathers from. And they'll feather these expandable nests and live in a very interesting way. But the roosting picture is for me a fabulous picture by John there. Now, this is one of my own pictures, which is why it's not of great quality. But this is a picture of me, rather, that I took, sat in my front room, looking through the window down the road, and I saw this incredible thing of a bird just disappearing down a chimney pot. And I assumed it had flown behind the house that I was looking at. And then I saw one come back, carrying kind of a chopstick length of twig, and drop them, release them down into the chimney tops. And it was brilliant to watch this. This was just one of the pictures I caught on a very simple camera. Now, this is a bird that's very well known for making nests in chimneys, and you can see the far chimney's got a cowl on it. At the time, this house didn't use its fireplaces and the chimneys were open, which was terrific news for this bird. So we're moving away from those small garden birds now, and we're moving away into what I'm just going to call the blackbirds for now. They're often referred to as corvids as a group. If you hear people talking about corvid, not COVID, obviously, corvid. Now, the distinguishing feature for me is, yes, it's a blackbird, but what else stands out to you? So when you see a bird, again, starting up at its head, what about its eye? What about its beak? It's a reasonably short beak. It's a very, very, very bright eye. Now, the truth is, if you're born in a chimney or any kind of living in a dark residence in a cavity or a chimney pot, having a really bright eye, and these young birds, I think, have actually bright blue eyes, is an indication so that when the parent bird comes back, they can see where the birds are. It's a really interesting thing that they've discovered, that the birds have these bright blue eyes when they're young that change slightly, but are still very, very distinct when they're older. So this type of blackbird, this type of corvid, is actually a jackdaw. And jackdaws, for me, are one of my favourite birds. There's a marvellous picture by Margaret Holland and the chimney one there by Nick Upton of another bird building a nest. I think what's important to me about jackdaws is, again, only a few years ago, I didn't know what a jackdaw was or how to distinguish it from other black types of birds. And it was only then, when you start to watch birds, you see the detail of an eye. Or more importantly, with a jackdaw, you see how it behaves, you see where it lives, where it builds its nests. They're on the TV aerials, you might remember in the earlier photograph, every single morning without fail. Jackdaws are very, very interesting birds in that they very often stay together for life. They very, very rarely go off with other birds, so to speak, and that's quite unusual in the bird world. And you'll see them being very attentive and preening each other and making sure they're in really top condition with their feathers, being very, very caring and considerate to each other. So I think jackdaws are a really interesting bird to take an interest in. When you see them walking around between pavements, picnic benches and so on, they have a very odd gait, which reminds me of a kind of a geezer kind of walking down the street as though they own the place. It's just the way they have of moving. And the sound they make is actually where it's a good example of a bird where the sounds they make contribute to the name that people know them by. And that's a really good thing, because if you see a group of blackbirds taking off and you're not necessarily sure if you're looking at a crow or a rook or a jackdaw, well, this sound can actually be what helps you distinguish. Then you can start to think about where you are, the fact that there could be quite a lot of them, but this would be the sound you'd be looking for. And this is the sound that contributed to its name. So that kind of chack, chack, chack noise, for some it may sound like jack, that's where the jackdaw came from. And you'll see them, they do well in groups, they're very acrobatic, very, very playful. They stick together in pairs, it's thought, because they know that it actually takes two to raise a chick, quite frankly. It's quite hard to provision a nest and keep things going. So jackdaws have a very specific behaviour around them. This is a different bird. I've gone to illustration now because actually illustrations for me can be better than photographs. This is another piece of artwork by Jackie Morris from The Lost Words. Now her focus here was actually the word conquer, but the two birds here, if you look, have got really distinguishing differences, regardless of their size, regardless of their habitat. If we just look at their heads again and their beaks, I'll just go briefly back to jackdaw. Think of that little short beak, the bright eye. We've got this whopping great beak now, and actually very, very pale. There's an element of skin coming down the beak, I think, that makes it so pale. And actually quite a pronounced pointy head, I would say, quite an angular head. It's an unusual shape. It hasn't got the smooth line of a jackdaw. If we were drawing a bird at any age, we'd probably draw more of a jackdaw shape than this kind of pointy head here. What we've got here is a couple of birds together. Now, actually, this is a bird that's very happy to be in huge numbers together. And this is a bird in the next photo, you may well know. We've got this bird on the left and that bird on the right. So this bird, the pointy head, the pale beak, picture by Margaret Holland, this is a rook. Now, on the right, we've got something which looks very, very different in different ways. Generally speaking, whenever I look, I know it's one or the other, but I'm never sure which. It's a bit of a binocular kind of job, really, because I'm looking for the head shape and the beak. People who get very, very specific get into their trousers. In that if you look at the bird on the left, it's got kind of shaggy trousers, baggy trousers. It's all kind of a bit, I don't know, a bit frayed at the underneath section there. Whereas on the right, you've got a very, very smart leg on a bird. This makes me sound rather weird, I guess, but this is what happens to you when you start to really wonder about the differences between similar birds. For me, it's in the beak, it's in the head shape, but for others, it's in what they think of as their trousers, the way their legs look. And that's why when we look at birds, if we're not sure, it's worth making a little note about all the different things you see. Because we've got a rook on the left and a crow on the right. Actually, a carrion crow is its full name. Now, there's an interesting thing here in that rooks are the birds that you will see in this next picture, which live communally in rookeries, huge numbers of nests making a great deal of noise. It's not known why they do this because, to be quite honest, it's very hectic living like that. There's an awful lot of squabbling between nests. Being a female rook is not particularly pleasant because there's an awful lot of nest hopping that goes on, whether you want to or not. There's an interesting issue that people look at rooks and think if there's a group, it's got to be rooks, and if it's a solitary bird, it's got to be a crow. Well, that's not quite right, because we can see here, depending on your photographs, you've got one of each here. So it still comes back to characteristics. There's an old country saying around, if you're seeing more than one, then it's rooks. If you're seeing only one, it's crow. But it's not entirely reliable. I'd go back to looking at the beaks, looking at their trousers, looking at their head, and looking at these two very, very different birds. Crow was an interesting one to put into a slide. I realised these photographers, who are fantastic in that they donate most of their photographs to the Wildlife Trust for free use for sessions such as these. And Margaret Holland, actually, I've noticed, has many photos being used by BBC Springwatch and other programmes of that quality. Well, no one seemed to take pictures of crows. There's literally hundreds of different birds, well, hundreds of any bird, and there was less than a handful of crow. And that really interested me, because when we get to thinking about birds, we start to realize people feel very, very differently about them. And people have all kinds of stigmas and beliefs and superstitions around birds. Crows as carrion feeders used to turn up after battles. They used to turn up after people were publicly executed centuries ago, and they would be seen to peck over corpses. Now they're providing a brilliant ecosystem service, it would probably be called these days, because we need our carrion feeders, whether they're burying beetles or carrion crows or vultures and so on. But people attach that as some kind of meaning to a bird. And I'm convinced that's why we've only got a handful of photos of crows. It was quite hard to find a picture of one to demonstrate this difference so well. But yeah, in a group, pale beak, pointy head, rook, on its own, far less sociable, carrion crow. One thing I would urge you to do after the session, I knew I wouldn't have time tonight, but I would have a look online for Japanese crow breaks nuts. There's a city called Sendai in Japan, and famously this was filmed. How clever corvids are. They're known to have fantastically active brains and be incredibly intelligent. And the carrion crows in Sendai had learnt that the nuts that they like to eat, which are incredibly hard, initially you could drop them from a great height and maybe that would work. They realised that if you drop them near traffic, cars could actually roll over the nut and crack it for you. Well, there are crows that mastered the idea of dropping nuts exactly onto pedestrian crossings, because that meant that traffic would roll over the nut and smash the nut. But more importantly than that, when the siren started to peep for the pelican crossing, the pedestrian crossing, all the traffic stopped. So the patient bird that had dropped the nut and waited for a car to smack it would then fly down and pick up the nut and fly away before the traffic started up again. So that we're talking about really high level intelligence. It's not unusual for these birds to use and fashion tools and solve all kinds of problems. But it's interesting, as I say, the human ideas and superstitions that we attach to them and some of the practices and beliefs that stem from that. Ever so quickly, the biggest, blackest of the birds that we'll see, particularly in Cumbria. Bottom right is Jackie Morris's painting of a raven. And we've got a really interesting angular shape there, a huge great beak. The rather grainy photos were just taken by me on my phone when I was up there a couple of winters ago. And I love it because it matched Jackie's picture. If you look ever so carefully, when I was sat eating my sausage roll for lunch, top right on the left-hand photo, a raven actually came to check me out. And that shows a really interesting intelligence and curiosity and interest in the new. I don't think for a minute it was interested in the food. I think it was actually just wondering why I was there, because there were very few people around. So it came and examined me. You'll see it stuck on a rock and then just flew in a circle around me very, very closely, allowed me to catch that picture of it in flight. And I think a raven is a really interesting example. It's as big as a buzzard pretty much, and buzzards are the big birds you'll see over the countryside and wonder what they are. But we've moved from the idea of the jackdaw to the larger rook and crow to the largest of the raven. And within those black birds, you've got distinguishing features. The beak of the rook, the behavior perhaps of the crow and the look of the crow, and then the habitat comes in. Ravens are going to be found on the crags, on the very high tops, on the cliffs, and they make an incredible cronking noise, which is very distinctive. Even if you're not quite sure, it doesn't sound as you would imagine it to sound. It's a very comical cronking noise, which will stick with you. And this is Rose Buck. I met Rose's husband, Lloyd. They care for birds and rehabilitate birds. And this is to give you a sense of the size of a raven up close. Rose was helping. This bird actually has a little transmitter on its back here, but you can see the look of a raven and the curiosity and intelligence of the bird, I think, immediately. They care for ravens for years and years and years because they're long-lived birds, and they've been involved in all kinds of things on TV and on film and so on. But it's a 24/7 job looking after birds in that way, and it's done with the best conditions of welfare for the birds. I just thought it was interesting to see the size of a raven perched on Rose's arm there. Back to the gardens, back to the things that we might see at home. I've never seen a raven at home, but I've seen crows fly by, and I certainly see rooks occasionally in the garden. We've shrunk all the way back down to blackbird size. I shan't say too much about blackbird, other than I live in South Cumbria, although slightly high up, about 150 metres altitude. And I noticed on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and so on, people were saying, oh, the blackbirds are singing, the blackbirds are singing. And then you look and you realise these people live in Somerset and further down south, or perhaps in warmer areas of the country. They certainly weren't singing here. They were looking really quite confused. They were evidently in the garden, just couldn't hear them at all. But I think wherever you are in Cumbria now, you have a great chance of hearing a blackbird sing. It's only just started last week with me. What I want to do is play you a blackbird song, just very briefly. Blackbirds often are talked about as actually the most beautiful song, never mind the nightingale. In fact, the famous song about a nightingale in Berkeley Square, it's believed it must have been a blackbird. Here's its song. So my challenge to you would be to see, certainly in this month, before the end of February, if you can hear that Chaffinch song, the falling down the stairs song, and if you can hear the whistling of a blackbird, that kind of do-do-do-do-do-do, that whistling sound. Very different songs, very, very common garden visitors, but that will help you, because if you can pick out a Chaffinch and a blackbird, you know everything else is something else. You start to narrow down what your options are and what you're listening to. Got to start somewhere, and I think those two birds at this time of year, particularly in Cumbria, but clearly now singing elsewhere, are the way to go. Now, I've lost my screen here, which I'm not entirely sure how that's happened. Here we go. I hope that's working out for everybody. Sorry about that, everyone. Female blackbird there, just to remind us that again, some birds vary between male and female. Great tit in the background to give us some scale. Very briefly touching on these, we're back into the blackbird size. We've got song thrushes singing now. There's a song thrush there by Karen Lloyd with its speckled chest. The song thrush is the bird that sings the same tune twice, 3 times usually, changes its tune, sings that 3 times, changes its tune, sings that 3 times. Song thrushes are now singing. They've been singing. They tend to only sing, particularly when they've paired up, they only sing first thing in the morning, last thing at night. So the song thrush, again, a lovely sound. Don't generally hear it through the day. You only hear it through the day if they fail to pair up. So I think a song thrush is another really good target. And what you can do is you can find these bird songs online on websites for free, whether it's the RSPB or Zeno Canto, which is a free resource of sound recordings. But I would seek out song thrush and try and listen to it, and you'll soon pick up what it is. I'll play it for you here, just because you'll see. Don't worry too much about how it sounds, because they vary hugely. The key with a song thrush is it does it 3 times. So as I say, not a blackbird, and the thing to look for there is great variability, but also that repetition 2 or 3 times. It's been referred to in poetry as repeating itself, just to prove it could do it the first time round. On the right are what we call our winter thrushes. These are still around, but they'll be disappearing soon. So should you see something that looks like a thrush but isn't a thrush, it's probably one of these guys. We've got a fieldfare top right and a redwing bottom right. Redwing, obviously, description of its name, red underwing there. And the fieldfare above, whenever I see a fieldfare, I'm never quite sure what I've seen, because all the colours seem to be in the wrong places and in the wrong order. But it's got that lovely kind of greys, browns, it's got patterns, it's a reasonably big bird. Fieldfares and redwings I've seen generally in the central fells in Cumbria, but people often see them if they live near farmland. Some people get them in their gardens and ground feeding and so on. Fieldfares and redwings kind of tolerate each other and actually look at how each other's feeding, because One of them's very, very good at hearing the food underground because they're interested in the insects, and the other's very good at locating good food sources. So they seem to be possible to see in mixed flocks. But it's a very good tip, I think, to think about the fact that thrushes can be mixed together. The one that will be around and that will stick around is the song thrush on the left. The song thrush being the bird that will often hunt out snails in the garden quite exclusively and bash the snails open on stones quite loudly, actually. It takes a bit of effort. They'll smash open the snail shell to get to the food inside. And if you find a collection of broken snail shells, very likely you found a thrush's anvil. But the birds on the right, should you happen to see a thrush that's not a thrush, very, very likely fieldfare at the top or redwing at the bottom. Favourite fieldfare fact is that they work as a gang. They work as a gang if they're under threat. If something turns up that might cause them trouble, it's not unusual for fieldfares to turn out in force and chase things away. More importantly, they will poo on their enemies. And that's really critical. If you're a bird, if you start getting covered in bird poo, it messes up your feathers, it messes up your ability to fly. It's a really good way of messing things up for a bird without getting involved in a fight. So fieldfares have got another very interesting intelligence and behaviour there. The winter thrushes tend to come down here because the ground is softer, the winters are cooler, and they'll be going back up to cooler rather than freezing, I would say. And they're going to head up back to Scandinavia soon and to colder parts, I would say. But song thrushes, I say, early and late in the day singing, that repetition, 2 or 3 songs from the speckled song thrush there. River birds, under local walks and restrictions and COVID conditions of walking, where I live, I tend to always go somewhere else, and I've not really walked around my local town, and I sort of see town as somewhere I don't really enjoy going. But there's a great river that runs through Kendal. There's a great river in most, not all, of the towns in Cumbria, streams and becks too. And I would say this is the time to particularly notice activity on the rivers because the foliage has died back, things are a bit easier to see. These are birds that are very evident on some of the cleaner rivers in Cumbria right now, in other parts of the country. Tom Marshall's picture there, the brown and white bird, is a dipper. Now, dipper's an absolutely marvellous bird to see. There are people who would travel a long way to see them, and we've got them very often, particularly in Cumbria, in our towns as well as in our countryside. They love fast-flowing rivers is the key, to give them that fresh water, to give them the underwater insect larvae that they like to eat. Dippers don't look like a water bird. They don't have webbed feet, but what they do have is very, very good insulation in their feathers, and they can waterproof themselves with this oil that they have, preening oil, which makes them very, very water resistant going through the water. The water just sort of shrink, well, like water off a duck's back, I guess. Water off a dipper's back would be just as accurate. The dippers you'll see bobbing around, they'll shoot underwater and spend quite some time walking around and catching food, because we're getting into rather unusual birds here. And again, thinking of bird behaviour, the dipper, I think, is one of the most unusual one. It doesn't look like a water bird, but it relies entirely on water for its habitat and for its food. On the right, we've got 2 wagtails, 2 very different wagtails. We've got a grey wagtail above, a pied wagtail below. The wagtail's name comes from how they behave. They just simply wag their tails an awful lot, and people aren't often sure why they do. It's just something they do. You'll often see pied wagtails running around, the black and white one. The grey wagtail can't go swimming like a dipper, but it lives in exactly the same habitat as a dipper, and that will catch insects that are flying around and on the riverside. So very often, if you've got dippers, you may well see a grey wagtail. You can also see grey wagtails around some of the lakes, places I often see them at places like Rydal Water in the Central Lakes, but elsewhere too. So yeah, rivers, but also standing bodies of water for the wagtails. Pied wagtail is the one of the 3 which has actually got a sound you can latch on to. When a pied wagtail's calling, it simply makes a noise that sounds like chiswick, chiswick. It's a very distinctive noise. I don't think any other bird matches it. So should you hear the kind of, it's a place name in London, I think, isn't it? Chiswick, chiswick, you know you're thinking of pied wagtails. Dippers very rarely heard in song, but they also make little peeps and little noises too. But I would urge you to try and spend a little time on your riverside. I noticed the photographer Terry Abraham was out on a river, Eden, today, and was looking at birds similar to this and others, which has really thrilled him as a photographer, but also as a nature lover. So I would say, yeah, if you're feeling confident now with some of your garden birds, extend your knowledge by trying a different habitat, trying riverside, and if you can, within travel conditions, obviously go around a lake, a pond, a stream, a tarn. I found dippers living in waterfalls, under farm bridges. There's a fabulous dipper nest on the Packhorse Bridge at Borrowdale Youth Hostel. Looks like half a mossy football. So you'll see these birds in a variety of watery places. Can't not mention these two. Chalk and cheese as birds. On the left here and on the right, two very, very different water birds. Essentially speaking, if you're interested in nature, if you're interested in ecology, if there's a body of water that can't attract these, it's not a very good body of water. These are quite tolerant, and they're kind of the first water birds you'll see around somewhere that can cope and thrive in places. On the left, we've got this red and yellow beak. On the right, we've got the white warning kind of sign of that bird. I'll explain that more in a moment. What we've got here are two birds which very often you'll see in the same sort of place, a moorhen with the yellow legs there, and a coot in the water on the right. Now I mention these because, again, thinking more of bird behaviour, coots, the black and white bird, are known to be incredibly aggressive. They will swim towards birds. They will actually run across the water. They do charging attacks. They're incredibly peevish, aggressive birds. It's just the nature of coots. It's probably why people use it as an insult when they refer to, miserable old coots and things, and people who have been unpleasant. I think if you were to be called a moorhen on the other side, that's a terrific compliment. It's not something that I've ever heard, but a moorhen living in the same habitat, same conditions, entirely different temperament. Moorhens will very often, if they're not tending a nest of their own, will lend a hand with care of other moorhens' chicks. They'll muck in together. Moorhens, when they have more than one brood of chicks, well, actually, the younger kids will muck in and help as part of the family. So that to me fascinates me, because the behaviour clearly isn't driven by habitat. It's not unusual to see coots, as I say, charging across the water, grabbing birds and ducking them under the water, and practically kickboxing with them. And yet the moorhen, it just keeps moving along. A really caring, considerate, sharing kind of bird, living in the same sort of habitat. But the key there, whether they're swimming or not, is the red-yellow beak and the white beak, the red of the moorhen, the white of the quite crazy coot. And last but not least, down by the water, picture on the right is what you'll probably see. John Hawkins is a brilliant photographer. John Hawkins at Surrey Hills, absolutely fabulous photographer, capturing kingfisher here. This kingfisher, if you look carefully, its bill is black and red, and that's a key to a female kingfisher. An all black bill would be a male. Kingfishers perch for a long time. They have the most incredible eyesight, and they move around to get binocular vision to see the fish in the water and then strike. So you'll see them move. You'll very often see them fly by. And this again was just down actually behind the sewage farm. I go to the best places. Behind the sewage treatment works in Kendal, kingfisher moving through willow and the riverside vegetation. That's the best picture I can manage without scaring the bird. But there's some fabulous photos online of kingfishers. Why would I even bother? I think the interesting thing for me with kingfisher is that's the first one I've actually seen still without moving. And they're frequently the things that fly by and you just don't get another look. So to find somewhere where they're actually still and hunting, taking their time to find their food, yeah, that was a real treat. I've only seen them a handful of times in my life, and I'll certainly be going back down to the sewage farm to have another look when I'm next in town on the shopping run. This is the bit which will make people roll their eyes and feel awful and possibly log off now. Do not worry. Do not worry. All we need to know is these are all gulls. Here's a good tip. If you want to stop feeling like a beginner, don't say seagull. I don't mind if you do, but some people get really worried because there's no such thing as a seagull. Gulls are gulls, and there are different types, and some are by the sea and some are inland, and they're great adapters. They change to their environment. there was a very interesting study done down in Barrow, which used to have a huge gull colony, which was largely reliant on the landfill site nearby. You may think back in the past when tips were open that gulls used to always be following around and on the refuse sites. Well, actually, what we've got here, if you look, is 5 birds. We've only actually got 2 different types. This is why gulls become confusing. There's only 2 types of gull here. The top 2 pictures are the birds that I saw down in Kendal along the river. And having seen them for years, went on holiday once to Dorset and looked at a bird which matched the picture on the left and thought, I've never seen one of those before. The bird on the top right is a black-headed gull. It's actually a bit chocolate brown rather than black, but a black-headed gull. On the left is also a black-headed gull without a black head. The black head is what they have in summer when they're at the height of breeding season. And it disappears for the most of the year. So black-headed gull is a rubbish name to have because they generally don't have a black head. But the key for me was that it seemed to have tiny feet. Again, looking at all the qualities of a bird, had a black spot on its face, red beak and tiny feet, and I thought, I've never seen one of them. Is it a rare bird? It's a black-headed gull, one of the most common gulls there is. But this is why gulls are tricky, and it's very easy to be dissuaded. But if you happen to get a chance to get to the coast at all, or even, as I say, for me, there were 3 dozen of them along the river in Kendal, think about the black-headed gull and how it's about to change as we go spring to summer. Lower down, you'll see this bird here with the yellow and red beak. Now that's what you may think of as your seagull. It does that great big long call, which is actually a way of a male bird saying, I'm here and I'm prepared to do nothing more about it. Because these gulls behave strangely. They make this great long racket, which is kind of the bane of people's life when they live by the seaside and work night shifts especially. But they're doing that to get the female gulls to come and check them out and to sort of see what they're like. It's their way of just advertising with minimal effort. So the herring gull here with the yellow and red beak has got a youngster behind it. Very, very different looking, completely different beak, similar legs, maybe more knobbly knees. They often do this weird sort of submissive position. But this is why gulls can seem confusing. Only 2 kinds of gulls here, and that's all I'd suggest you try and narrow down if you're interested in looking at gulls. Look for the black-headed gulls and the way they change. Look for the herring gulls with the yellow and red. The little red dot on the beak is actually the stimulus to be fed for these birds. So you'll see the birds tapping the red dot on the other beaks. It happens between adults of different sexes, as well as the youngsters begging to be fed, because they're fed by that rather interesting technique of gulls of regurgitation of food for others. So yeah, gulls, it's an acquired taste, gulls, but I would say black-headed gulls and herring gulls is a brilliant place to start. Ever so quickly on this one, all I'm going to say is Zorro. Now, this is a different way of getting to know birds. You've got a very unusual bird here, but the thing that I always see is the bandit mask that Zorro used to wear. So I've never called it anything else. It's actually a nuthatch. It has a very unusual behavior. It's one of a very small number of birds that will run down a tree. I say run down, it kind of lumps down because it's really gripping on and going 1 foot at a time. It's a nuthatch because it's built stockily. It's got this incredible beak to bash nuts open. But for me, it's a different way of thinking, how am I ever going to remember these things? Well, I've got a bird there, which without fail, I'll see with the eye mask, I'll see with a bandit stripe, and I kind of call it Zorro, and it gives me a shorthand to think, well, it's a Zorro, or Zorro's a nuthatch. It's a different way of thinking about how you might retain the names of birds. Speaking of birds that go up and down trees, we've got here greater spotted woodpecker. Occasional garden visitors. The reason I like the picture here by John Hawkins is we've got a youngster in the nest hole there. You see with the red patch on the head tells us straight away this is a young bird. It's waiting to be fed. And we've actually got both parents at this very same nest next door to it. The youngster's there. And you can see, if you look ever so carefully, at the back of the head of the far bird, there's a tiny bit of red. What happens is with the young birds, red on the front, slips round to the back on the older male birds. The females don't have that red patch at all. So there's a little way of starting to know more about when you're seeing woodpeckers, if you're seeing a pair or a family group, the youngsters, the adults. Greater spotted woodpeckers will now be drumming. They actually drum rather than singing, and they'll drum in the loudest way possible. Near us, we had power station kind of pole, which had a lead cap put on the top of it. And the bird realised if it hit the metal cap, rather, it created a massive percussive noise. And I've heard them also drumming on owl boxes. If you can imagine whacking a great wooden box, made such a better noise. They'll check trees out for the best noise. It's a way of them demonstrating themselves and their whereabouts. Just the last couple of slides as we come towards the end of our hour. Now, this is not to depress you. This is where we start to venture into the realm of what birders will call LBJs, little brown jobs. These are two completely different birds, almost impossible to tell apart. These are birds that are going to arrive, in one case, certainly before the end of March, maybe before the next time we meet. That's David's picture. I'm going to use David's name for now. Bob's picture is a bird that comes later. There's one tiny difference between these birds, which is that the wing feathers project a bit further. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not going to try and identify these birds by sight. What I am going to say is you're into a group of birds that are sometimes called warblers. And David's picture on the left is actually a bird whose name is its sound. So this is a bird that some of you will know, maybe never see, maybe never recognize confidently, but you'll definitely never mistake its sound. It's a bird called the chiffchaff, and a chiffchaff is due to arrive in Cumbria before the end of March. Here we are. This is the sound a chiffchaff will be making soon. Not that one. Not that one. So the chiffchaff is that two-tone. So the chiffchaff sound is that chiff-chaff, chiff-chaff. Sometimes it shuffles them around, chiff-chaff, chiff, chaff, chiff, chuff, even a chuff. But the chiff-chaff noise is very, very repetitive. They sing an awful lot. They'll often be at the very top of trees. So the way of spotting them is to look up. And the chiff-chaff really is an interesting one because it's a rather odd bird. Doesn't help build a nest, doesn't help feed the chicks, doesn't help feed its mate. But it's a lovely bird to see in summer. Kind of a very absent father figure, really. Real lazy bird. On the right, we've got a Willow Warbler. Now, this is the bird, hundreds of years ago, Gilbert White could determine the two. And this is because back then, he was thinking of how they sing. And a Willow Warbler song couldn't be more different to a chiffchaff's. It's the last song I'm going to play for you tonight. This is a Willow Warbler. It'll be arriving slightly after the chiffchaff, partly because it flies in from further away. It flies in from sub-Saharan Africa rather than Mediterranean. So this migrant bird, Willow Warbler, has a lovely song I call Falling Leaf, a slow descending, makes me think of the measured shape of a leaf falling down in the breeze. Willow Warbler. If and when you're allowed to travel, the Cumbria Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve at Foulshaw Moss is a brilliant place. There'll be a Willow Warbler on the top of every tree. They're interesting birds too. The males arrive 2 weeks before the females. They sing like mad and get tuned up. And when the females arrive, they'll fly around every single one to see who they like the look and the sound of most. It's like some really weird audition. And there we are. Could be a chiffchaff, could be a Willow Warbler. I don't worry and I don't care. I'll know when I hear it. Last but not least, cuckoos. Not long now. Next session, we're going to get much more into the birds that arrive in spring, late spring, and even summer. We'll talk also about some of the other things going on. There's a cuckoo flower in that picture, actually. Flowers that arrive around the time of the cuckoo get the name from the birds and so on. Some fabulous folklore in Cumbria, particularly about Borrowdale around cuckoos too. So we'll be moving more into birds on the next session, more into what we'll be seeing and hearing by then in March and going into April. And last but not least, definitely by next time, we'll actually take a little look at the young birds, the fledglings, the chicks. Got this tiny little bird here, barely got its eyes open in my garden. I only cut my grass twice a year, so that must have been very early in the season because the grass was rather short. So I hope you've enjoyed the hour with us tonight. I hope it's not been too much because I do know it can be overwhelming. But if you've picked up a couple of things that you now know or a couple of things to look for, I think that's brilliant, frankly. Thank you for joining us, for supporting Cumbria Wildlife Trust. If you're not a member, please consider becoming a member and helping us run these events that way and others. And volunteering if you can. We hope we'll be able to reopen volunteering soon. We're allowed to do certain volunteering even under restrictions, but we're just playing it very careful while we hopefully come out of this lockdown and move on with our lives. Keep enjoying birds, and thank you very much for joining us. My name was Jamie, and the whole thing happened today because of my colleague Mel, who actually finished work with us at the Trust today and set these brilliant things up for us. She's now been replaced by someone called Helen as Mel moves on from her training period with us. So look forward to working with Helen in the future and seeing you all again. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.